Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Luberoff. I'm the Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first of our spring semester housing research seminars. You can see the full list on our website, and hopefully you're all on our email list. Before we get started, just to let you know, this is being recorded. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. I'm particularly excited today because we're kicking off, as we have done for the last several spring semesters, with a presentation by our two Gramlich Fellows. The Gramlich Fellowship is one of several that the Joint Center offers for students, Harvard graduate students who are returning in the fall. The Gramlich Fellowship is done in partnership with NeighborWorks America, and as you'll hear, it gives students an opportunity to spend the summer researching a topic of particular interest to both the organizations in NeighborWorks America and folks here at the Joint Center for Housing. The application deadline for that fellowship is coming up. It's on February 12th. If you'd like to know more about that or our other fellowships, you can both visit our website, and we will be offering an information session for Harvard students on this coming Thursday at 5 p.m. Look for an email from us with details on that and how to register. So today we're going to hear from Ben Demers, a dual degree student at the Kennedy School and the Graduate School of Design, and Kyle Yoder, a student at the Kennedy School. We'll hear first from Ben, who will be discussing his research on how NeighborWorks organizations responded to COVID-19's racially disparate impacts. Really quite wonderful piece of work. And then Kyle will be talking about Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast, Promising Practices in Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Governance of NeighborWorks Organizations. Ben will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will shift to Kyle, and then we will take Q&A at the end, and we will end roughly at 1:15. Ben, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, David. Let me just share my screen. All right, are y'all seeing this?
Yes, looks good.
All right, great. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I want to start off by saying 2020 obviously was an extremely intense year, both generally, but also specifically for community development organizations who were really thrown a lot of challenges to try to overcome. Since January 2020, we've seen over 25.8 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the United States and over 400,000 confirmed deaths, as well as widespread unemployment from the pandemic that's had devastating impacts on our economies. By early April, we were also hearing about how this pandemic was disproportionately impacting low-income communities where many NeighborWorks organizations center their work, and specifically how low-income Black and Brown communities were really taking the brunt of this impact because of underlying health and economic conditions. And then on top of that, while already dealing with something that felt really incomprehensible, we witnessed the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which sparked national protests and conversations around racism and police brutality. And I think here to a definition of racism from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that's been very guiding for me in this project. And she defines the term as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, which I think is a really useful way of thinking about the term when trying to link contemporary discussions around the disparate racial impact of the pandemic to other systems of racism within the United States. And so my research project, titled How NeighborWorks America Network Organizations Are Responding to the Racially Disparate Impact of COVID-19 in Black Communities, it really came about as a way to try to process and make sense of things as they were happening, with the main focus being simply to document the work that community development organizations were doing to respond to the pandemic, given broader conversations that were occurring around American racism. And I really wanted to answer two specific questions. So first, how are community development organizations that are based in predominantly Black communities pursuing racial equity goals in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And then second, how has the confluence of the pandemic and national conversations around racism and police brutality allowed organizations to advocate for a more racially equitable recovery moving forward? And so this presentation presents the findings that begin to answer these questions, focusing on COVID-19 related initiatives, but really kind of considering the cultural moment in which these initiatives were taking shape. In the interest of time, I'm going to assume that a lot of people on today's call have already had some exposure to the data around how Black communities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So I'll jump quickly into the methodology that I used to collect the data for my case studies, and then I'll discuss my 4 case studies and the work that they've been doing. And then I'll discuss themes that arose across the 4 organizations, along with some exemplary initiatives before we open things up to comments or questions. And before I get into it, I also do want to say thank you to both of my mentors during this process, Dr. Christy Cade, who's the Senior Director of the Southern Region with NeighborWorks America, and Dr. Jen Malinsky, who's a Senior Associate and Lecturer at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, both of whom were so incredible at guiding in a topic that at times felt like it was changing too quickly to write about comprehensively. So truly thank you to both of you. Now, to understand organizational responses, I conducted 22 interviews with NeighborWorks America staff, organizational staff, and board members at the 4 case studies, and a representative from the National NeighborWorks Association, which is an advocacy organization for network members. And then this data was supplemented with news reports and official documents detailing the work of these organizations, as well as census and COVID-19 data to get a better sense of how these organizations were working and who they were working with. And I'll note here that the COVID-19 data you see in this presentation is from late August when I was compiling my research. So it's really meant to be giving a snapshot from last summer, which gives a better idea of the context in which the initiatives that I'm discussing are actually being introduced. And then lastly, I want to make a note about what I mean by racially equitable responses to the pandemic. Oh, sorry about that. So the community development movement in the United States grew extensively out of the work of the civil rights movement and out of Black organizing. And still today, a lot of community development organizations obviously do work in Black communities. For some, they might explicitly position their work this way as fighting against racism. However, many organizations don't use the language of race in this way, even though they may inherently support Black communities, given that they're based in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, or they focus on issues that disproportionately impact Black people. I'm not here to make a value judgment either way in this presentation. There are many reasons for both approaches, but it's to say that in my efforts to document these initiatives, I tried to listen for both work that was explicit about uplifting Black communities, as well as work that was implicitly having this effect. And so I was really looking for anything that essentially imagined how recovery from the pandemic could mitigate racial inequalities in health and economics, and could also center the experience of Black communities in that recovery process. So with that, let me introduce my case study organizations. So when selecting case studies, Christy and I had decided that it would make sense to do one organization from each of the major regions that NeighborWorks is split into, and to also sort of capture a range of focus areas. So some on housing, some on community financing. And so the 4 case studies that we decided on are Neighborhood Housing Services of Los Angeles County, obviously working in LA County, California. Beyond Housing, which is based in the Normandy School Collaborative near St. Louis, Missouri. Urban Edge, based in Boston, Massachusetts, and then finally Hope Enterprise Corporation, which works across 5 states in the Deep South. And let's look a little more in detail at their backgrounds and the context in which they were working. So NHS of Los Angeles County does work all throughout LA County, though they still really like to focus on target neighborhoods and cities such as Compton and Southeast LA County. Their main services include financial education and counseling, affordable mortgage lending, construction management services, mission-driven real estate, and neighborhood revitalization and advocacy. And the organization is very race conscious in its approach, with 89% of the people they work with being people of color. And of this, about 41 to 44% of their community is Black, even though Black people make up only about 9% of the county's overall population. California is the state with the most documented cases, obviously, of COVID-19. And at the end of the summer, this was already true. It had already seen over 200,000 confirmed cases. And LA County's Department of Public Health had reported that Black residents were twice as likely to die from COVID-19 when compared to white residents. And that communities with high levels of poverty were 4 times as likely to die of COVID-19 as communities with low levels of poverty. Second, Beyond Housing is engaged in almost all of NeighborWorks' lines of business other than rural work, including homebuyer education and affordable housing management, but it's particularly well known for its community building and engagement work using the philosophy Ask, Align, and Act. And they used to work primarily in Pagedale, Missouri, but are now based in the Normandy School Collaborative, which is the school district that includes Pagedale along with 23 other towns. That school district is about 83% Black, which is one of the highest in the county, and it has a median income of about $33,000, which is one of the lowest in the county. So they definitely understand that their work has a racialized component. COVID-19 data is not super easy to obtain at the school district level, but we are fortunate to be able to look to a local clinic that was actually brought to the area by Beyond Housing. And as of late June, when the clinic was first releasing statistics publicly, they had seen an 8.8% positive rate compared to a 5.7% rate in the state overall. The third organization, Urban Edge, started in 1974 to do home ownership counseling and rehabilitation work in the area on the border or the edge of Roxbury and Jamaica Plain neighborhoods in Boston. And if you're familiar with Boston, you'll know that these neighborhoods are two of the centers of the city's Black and Brown communities. And when they started, the organization really saw itself as responding to redlining within Roxbury, which you can see here in the map is this red section. And since their founding, they've also begun doing more construction and management of multifamily affordable housing. Now, when I pulled COVID-19 data for Boston on August 7th, there'd been about 15,000 cases, or about 2,000 per 100,000 residents, which was actually similar to the rate for LA County at that time. Black residents had made up about 36% of all cases and 35% of all deaths, even though they only make up about 25% of Boston's population. And early on, they were actually accounting for about 42% of all cases, suggesting that the virus spread faster early on in Black communities. And then finally, Hope Enterprise Corporation, as mentioned, is a CDFI that works in tandem with a second organization, Hope Credit Union. And then within the Enterprise Corporation, they have something called the Hope Policy Institute. So I'll kind of refer to them all under the heading of Hope. The organization works in 5 states in the Deep South, so Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee. And they offer a range of services from personal and business banking to influxes of funding into extremely low-income areas. And then they also offer community development initiatives, such as helping finance community facilities like schools, as well as hospitals and housing. The organization is very race conscious and explicit about this. Its team is primarily led by people of color, and it's one of the only organizations that I have seen use racially explicit language in its mission statement. And when looking at the demographics of the 5 states that make up its service area, all 5 states rank within the top 12 in the country for the proportion of Black residents, with Mississippi being the highest, with 38% of its population identifying as Black. The Harvard Global Health Institute map of COVID-19, which you can see here on the slide, also placed all 5 states amongst the 11 highest rates when controlling for population when I compiled data on August 7th. And so that's changed a bit since then, but this is really the picture that was happening at the time, and we were seeing an explosion in the South. At that time, Louisiana was the highest, Mississippi was the 2nd highest, and Alabama was the 3rd highest. In Mississippi, where as mentioned, Black residents make up 38% of the population, they were accounting for 72% of COVID-19 deaths. So as you can see, I was really researching organizations that have some overlap in the work they do, but a lot that makes their work unique. And all of these organizations, though, were working extensively in Black communities and have for many years, and they were seeing those communities being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Now, for the sake of time, for the sake of time, I'm not going to dive into all of the different initiatives that I discussed with each of these organizations, but instead I want to highlight some trends amongst their work, and I'm going to weave in some examples of the different initiatives to sort of illustrate the points. All right. So the first trend is sort of an obvious one, given that I spoke specifically with organizations that do work in Black communities, but a big part of what I heard when asking how they were incorporating racial equity into their response was simply by continuing the work that they're already doing, given that it was already having this effect. And this speaks sort of to that implicit, explicit distinction that I spoke to earlier. For instance, Urban Edge continued to offer homeowner education to local community members through virtual courses, even when they went like fully remote. And they even expanded the number of sessions that they offered in anticipation that people would not be able to pay their mortgages due to pandemic-related financial hardships. These courses already serve a higher proportion of Black homeowners than the overall proportion of the city, and they continue to do so during the pandemic. And therefore, the impact of continuing to offer this education is that it disproportionately has helped Black homeowners find ways to keep their homes or know what they can do if they can't pay. And so this was also an initiative that was used by NHS of LA and like a very important focus area for them. And I note this first also because, mirroring what I mentioned earlier, several organizations discussed how they don't feel the need to label their work as racial equity, even with the greater attention that these terms are receiving over the summer, given that this is the work that they do every day. So while that wasn't true for all organizations, which I'll discuss a bit later on, it's an important note that I want to keep in mind when we're thinking about how this work is ultimately made visible. The second trend is that organizations are determining what local Black residents need by conducting community outreach. And this is both a continuation of existing work, but also has involved some more pointed outreach since the start of the pandemic and since the conversations over the summer. And we can look here to an example of Beyond Housing and their communication since the beginning of the pandemic. So when I say that it's somewhat a continuation of previous work, this is because all of the organizations that I spoke with, including Beyond Housing, already have done a lot of work to figure out how to reach local Black residents, given years of distrust of government organizations and other groups that have claimed to bring community investment but haven't followed through. So the organization has formed relationships with trusted local leaders like local clergy, Black radio station hosts, and other influential individuals, which it was then able to quickly use during the pandemic to spread the word about the services it was offering, such as food pickup, and to also ask people what they needed. And they noted that their services were particularly well utilized compared to similar organizations in the area because they already had these pre-existing networks. However, since March 2020, the organization has also conducted outreach specifically to Black business owners that they've worked with to provide them with support. So for example, several Black business owners were hoping to open properties in a new building they're putting up, and the organization heard from these businesses that what they really needed was cash. And so they're now providing them with grants in order to weather the pandemic until those properties can open and those businesses can function. And so I think this work both shows that specific outreach in Black communities is obviously needed to build trust and understand needs, but also that this trust and these networks are things that they take a long time to build, obviously. So as we're thinking about recovery measures to the pandemic, it's important to look to trusted organizations who can facilitate that work in heavily impacted communities. The third trend is that organizations are very actively filling the gaps left by federal aid policies that were meant to be sort of race neutral, but which have not adequately aided Black communities. And I think this is one of the most important things that came up in my research. And I'll turn to Hope here for a few great examples of this. So for context of one such policy, local CARES Act funding is administered by state level governments to different towns and counties, which different states do slightly differently. So in Alabama, the policy is that states have to front the costs of COVID-19 relief measures, and then they can be reimbursed afterwards, which allows for state oversight of how the funds are spent. However, Hope was contacted by 2 state senators in Alabama who represent portions of the Black Belt, which is a historically Black and fairly rural strip of the state, when they realized that this model means that counties of persistent poverty, which in Alabama and other areas of the South are disproportionately Black, would have not had enough money to actually pay the upfront costs to then be reimbursed by the CARES Act funding. So Hope worked with the Black Belt Community Foundation and provided a loan to the foundation to administer upfront funds to towns and counties, which could then apply for reimbursement and pay Hope back through the foundation. And so to raise money for those funds, Hope reached out to several different businesses in Birmingham for contributions. So they saw where a policy was not working, and they stepped in to encourage a more equitable allocation of resources. Related to this, Hope also saw that PPP funding was not reaching Black-owned businesses at the same rate as white-owned businesses, because many of these businesses don't have the same pre-existing banking relationships that were necessary to apply, and several other reasons. So Hope conducted specific outreach to Black-owned businesses throughout their service area to check if this was an issue, and confirming that it was, they then helped them apply for PPP funding, with 46% of all PPP loans that they administered going to business owners of color. And so this was a gap, again, that Beyond Housing similarly saw and tried to connect business owners with financial support to help them apply. And so really seeing where these government policies weren't addressing these disparate impacts and trying to sort of fill in the gap that was left. The fourth trend is that organizations are leveraging partnerships with other organizations when they're seeing racially disparate impacts that they themselves can't respond to. And I obviously just mentioned one with Hope working with the Black Belt Community Foundation. And I should also add that the representative from Hope with whom I spoke said that Alabama-based companies were more willing than in the past to provide loan funding because of the growing attention that was being given to racial inequality and the need that was becoming very obvious in the Black Belt. And so we saw a shift in that discourse and a willingness to engage, and Hope was able to sort of work with that partnership. We also see this with health organizations. So for instance, Beyond Housing worked with a local clinic. They provided a $25,000 donation and coordinated donations from several other groups to allow the clinic to offer free COVID-19 testing to local residents. And it was because of this testing that I was even able to present that earlier statistic of an 8.8% positive rate in this predominantly Black school district. So they saw what they could do and they leveraged that partnership, and they knew that in this instance, they could bring in funding where another organization could actually provide the service. We also see this with organizations that might focus more explicitly on race, and so sort of deepening those partnerships. So for instance, several organizations partnered with the NAACP on advocacy work and provided them with research. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we also see with organizations finding more opportunities to collaborate with corporate partners, such as the example I gave with Hope, who have access to funds and who, especially with the discourse around Black Lives Matter, were more open to partnership and have since been since the summer. The fifth trend that came up repeatedly in my research is that organizations are also learning from past crises and their disparate racial impacts. And in particular, the 2008 financial crisis came up repeatedly. Though I did also hear a lot of comparisons to Hurricane Katrina in particular, but the financial crisis was really sort of the basis for how organizations might shift their work. So for instance, NHS of LA had started a project shortly after the 2008 financial crisis called the Legacy Project, which was meant to encourage a narrative of Black homeownership, and then also to actually acquire cheap land that was coming on the market as people, and especially Black people, were losing their homes at disproportionate rates, with the organization hoping to then develop affordable housing on these sites, and so keep the sites affordable in the long run for the community. But the second part has been very difficult to fund, and they've been waiting really for the moment to try to raise these funds. And with the spotlight on race from the pandemic and the protests, they're hoping that that moment is now. So they're really sort of looking for corporate partners, but they've also signed on to something called the Black People's Letter. They've also signed on to something called the Black People's Letter, which was a letter written with several dozen other Black-led organizations in LA County and sent to their congressional representatives, calling for a suspension of rent and mortgage payments, restrictions on corporate real estate speculation, acquiring distressed homes, and the creation of a buyout fund and first right to purchase these distressed properties for affordable housing developers. And they say explicitly in the letter that this is because they saw so much speculation happen after 2008, and they saw so many Black homeowners lose their homes, and they know how easy it is for that to happen again. So they're trying to make these issues extremely visible using this previous comparison point. And then the sixth and final observation that I'll make is that organizations are finding new opportunities for more explicit advocacy and a more explicit link to racial justice in that advocacy because of the increased national attention on racial equity. And so, while as I said, some organizations don't really feel the need to be explicit in that way, others do, and they are taking the opportunity. So Beyond Housing, for instance, has been much more explicit in its discussion of race, as it's kind of sought to connect the issues of businesses in their community with broader discussions of the issues that Black-owned business owners are facing. Hope has also really stepped into this moment and has stressed how CDFIs have a proven track record in communities of color and how the support was needed for Black communities now more than ever. So with this argument, they made the largest ever request to Congress for funding allocations to CDFIs, a $1 billion request in order to respond to the pandemic. And although they didn't get the allocation, they did see set-asides in a subsequent round of PPP funding for CDFIs to administer these resources. And really, more than that, they just changed the idea of what an allocation that you could ask for would actually be. And in the framing of their advocacy itself and in their policy research, they've been pretty explicitly linking this to George Floyd's death and the underlying factors that make Black people more vulnerable to both the virus and police brutality. Okay, now I'm running up on time, but I do want to quickly say some learnings. Obviously, the goal of this project was really more to document rather than to make recommendations, but I do want to kind of review a few key learnings for those who are providing aid at both the federal and local levels, which will be sort of more formalized in the paper version of this presentation. A major note is to simply acknowledge the extremely vital role that these organizations are playing in lessening the disparate racial impact of the pandemic. So there's definitely the need for government bodies to more explicitly acknowledge racial disparities so that they can actually account for it in their policy making. And they can turn to organizations like the ones I spoke with to learn where these disparities actually exist in implementation, since it's these organizations that are observing this disparity and they're filling in the gaps. This also means listening to what these organizations are requesting. So for instance, both Hope and NHS of LA have shown the ways in which CDFIs and affordable housing developers in predominantly Black states and neighborhoods can help facilitate Black wealth building and mitigate losses of wealth already acquired. And yet the requests for funds to pursue these projects continue to be ignored. And then lastly, even as we seek to make the racial implications of this work more visible on the national stage, and as many organizations do seize the opportunity to be more explicit, it's important to remember that not every organization that's doing racial equity work is going to use this language, which is, I think, kind of simplistic and obvious, but it also became an important consideration as I'm starting to see a lot of philanthropy, especially making a bigger effort to consider race-focused work and thinking about how they'll be assessing that work. So when they're looking for models of work to lift up and to support with resources, we need to keep in mind and look equally at an organization's impact as the language it's using. So with that, I'm definitely over time, but thank you, and I will turn it over to David. David, you're muted.
Thank you. I got to see some version of this earlier or at the end of the summer, and I was amazed then at how much ground you were able to cover in the 10 weeks of the fellowship, and I continue to be amazed. Folks have started to post questions. We're going to take those after Kyle's presentation because I think there are going to be some overlapping themes, and we'll see what we can get to. And actually, you were right on time, so don't worry about it. Kyle Yoder, as I mentioned, is a Master in Public Policy student, and has been looking at, I think, a really related question, or looked at a really related question around efforts to bring race, equity, diversity, and inclusion into the governance of NeighborWorks organizations. And I will let him tell you that story. Kyle, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. And let me just get my slides up. All right, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen, but thank you, David, again, and thank you, Ben, for that wonderful presentation there at the beginning. Like David said, my name is Kyle Yoder. I'm a MPP, Master of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, focusing in social and urban policy and getting a certificate in management, leadership, and decision sciences. My project for the Gramlich this past summer was Culture Eat Strategy for Breakfast, looking at the promising practices in race, equity, diversity, and inclusion across the governance of NeighborWorks organizations. So just a little bit of a roadmap. We are short on time, so I'm only going to be covering a small piece of the research and work that I covered over the summer, but I'll review kind of the project scope and aim, my methodology, some of the practices and themes I found across the governance structures of NeighborWorks network organizations, primarily focused on their boards, although of course it's important to note that executive directors, staff, and the broader federated network of NeighborWorks America all have roles to play in this work, as well, of course, as members of the local communities that these organizations are serving. And then we'll have time at the end, I believe, for questions and discussions in the Q&A if you want to use that as we go. Right up front, I just want to say thank you as well to David Luberoff, Deputy Director here at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, who was one of my two mentors for this project over the course of the summer. I also want to thank Jen Christian, who is the Director of Network Leadership Development at NeighborWorks America. I had to glance down just to make sure I get her title correct, but both of them were invaluable in terms of their support for this project over the course of the summer. So with that, tell you a little bit about what I was actually setting up to do, what I was actually trying to do with this project. Spoke to a whole lot of folks, a whole lot of people at various levels and in various positions across the NeighborWorks network of various organizations, and really seeking to provide compass bearing for boards as they seek to lead the equity, diversity, and inclusion work in their organizations, with an eye that this work really has to be rooted in the local communities in which it is based, really focused on communities determining what is right for them and really having the power to make that those decisions as necessary. Of course, this is rooted in principles of good governance, but really shaped by the present moment, namely the two pandemics that we've faced in 2020 of the spotlight on systemic racism and COVID-19, and really just bringing this moment to bear in the governance of these network organizations. So just a few things to keep in mind as we move forward. This is meant as a broad foundation for future work. This should not be seen as in any way, shape, or form as a punctuation on this story. And I'm really focusing here on that I in EDI or DEI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This topic is big. It's squishy, it's alive, it's really focused in culture, it's really focused in people, and it's really focused in the context of a given group of people in a given room at a given time. So my goal in this presentation is to provide you some of the big themes, some of the big takeaways from this work, and illustrate as I go throughout with some examples here and there, but really with the hope that you as the audience can take some of these lessons and promising practices and apply them in your own situation, in your own setting. Real quickly up front here, I just want to name this distinction between diversity and inclusion. Ben touched on equity earlier in his presentation. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm taking as a given that diversity is good in management and leadership structures. There's a whole bunch of literature out there if you want to go and look into that. For the purposes of time today, we're just taking that as given and really focusing on inclusion, which, as a number of the people I spoke to noted, people often think that they are doing inclusion work when all they're really doing is diversity. Inclusion, diversity being having a lot of different voices and different people represented, but inclusion really making those people feel like their voices matter, making them engaged, making sure that they have the resources to engage and to engage fully and actively at every step in the decision-making process. I've already mentioned that I'm going to be focusing primarily on boards today, but it is important to note that staff that executive directors all have roles to play in this work as well. There's often this kind of false dichotomy between boards versus staff who has ownership over what areas of operations. And as many of the people I interviewed said, it really has to be both boards and staff, boards with staff. And of course, it's important to note up front that in the nonprofit world, boards are comprised of individuals who are volunteering their time and expertise. So with an eye towards really making this actionable, really making this something that can be applied, keeping that at the forefront of our consciousness so that we're not just saying, oh, they need to do this, 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 and this, and this, without an eye towards what is actually feasible or what is actually going to be able to be played out in the real world. So quickly here, my methodology over the course of the summer, I conducted over 40 interviews with 17 board chairs, board members, executive directors of various network organizations in the NeighborWorks network. 10 organizations were represented entirely in total across coast to coast, and trying to get as much representation in the sample as possible in terms of different geographic regions, different service populations, and really just trying to cover as many bases as possible there. Additionally, speaking with outside experts, consultants, academics, organizers, and staff at the NeighborWorks America national level as well. Importantly here, just noting up front, my interviews were all based on referrals, so they should not be seen as a representative sample, even though I was trying to cover as many bases as possible. They were largely organic, really interested in hearing what they had to say, and really, as I'll say here in a minute here, really allowing people to be the experts of their own lived experience. And importantly, they were all off the record. So I'm going to be trying to mask to the extent possible who was saying something or what was said in the room, just because I want to respect the candor and honesty with which people spoke to me, but really focusing on the lessons learned in the room and bringing those to bear here as well. So, and just very quickly, for anyone on the call not familiar, NeighborWorks has these wonderful community agreements that all members of the network root their work in. And in particular, the work when it comes to inclusion work is really focused on these last three: being willing to do things differently and experience discomfort, expecting and accepting non-closure, and keeping in mind that this is a process, a journey of continuous improvement. And again, confidentiality, really, honoring people's candor and their willingness to speak openly. So quickly here with my remaining time, I want to spend focusing on these main themes, these 5 main themes that I've highlighted here on the screen for you. No single size fits all, root and data and story, focus on people, form determines function, iterate, iterate, iterate. I could go on longer. If there are questions in the chat, I'm happy to as well, but just for the sake of time, we're going to focus our discussion today around these 5. And in particular, what they look like in practice. So just to start, no single size fits all. When it comes to creating an inclusive governance structure, when it comes to really making sure that people feel that their voices are welcome and belong in the room, every community, every organization, every board is going to be different. And that applies over time as well. What fits a given organization on one day is going to be very different than what works in that organization in a year or in 2 years or in a decade. And that's okay, that's natural, that's good. So with an eye towards that, don't assume what people need. And this is a big theme that keeps coming up and again and again and again, but really engaging real communities and the communities that are being served in what do they need, as opposed to what is often the case in governance structures from the top down, saying this is what will serve people the best, really allowing them to be the determinants of that. The second point here, be intentional, minding your impact, striving for ownership. There's this tension that is often talked about in spaces of equity and inclusion between intent and impact, right? People want to talk about, well, I had good intentions, but as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. People want to focus on their impact and really measuring what impact that they're having. But of course, if you're overly focused on metrics, you're going to miss things that you're not measuring or not even thinking to measure. So you really need to have both. As one of the people that I spoke to says, what we're really striving for in this work is ownership, this idea that we're guided by our intentions and by our good impacts, but with an eye always towards having a better and better impact towards getting us to that state that we intend to reach. And then finally, this point here, listening requires the willingness to change. In a former life before coming back to graduate school, I was working as an organizer and as a theater teacher, and I used to teach improv classes. And when I would teach workshops on improv, I'd often begin with a lecture around listening, because in improv, nothing is scripted. You don't know what you're hearing, and you're responding in real time to what the other people on stage are giving you. When we listen as human beings, our tendency is often to listen just long enough to be able to say our piece, to be able to respond to the thing that we want to say. But true listening, really engaging the other person that you're speaking to, or in this case, really engaging the communities that you are seeking to serve, requires a willingness to change your behavior, to say, yes, I hear what you're saying, let me do this thing differently, let me adapt, let me clarify what you mean, whatever it might be, but it can't just be, yes, I hear you, I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do anyway. So just to pull in a couple of examples here, one organization that I think really embodies this last point of listening requiring a willingness to change. They are a organization that serves a predominantly white, predominantly rural community. And they, a few years ago, were hearing kind of the national conversation around race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we're thinking this doesn't really apply to us. Our community is fairly monolithic in many regards. But after they brought in a new executive director who really pushed them to see, go out into the community, go out and listen. Who are we not hearing right now? Who are we blind to with our blinders on? They realized, actually, we have a much more diverse population in our service community. In particular, they have a large Latinx migrant population in the area that they serve that they were just not seeing, because their all of their work, all of their publications, all of their resources were English language only. We're very targeted at the neighborhoods and communities that they'd always been targeted to. And there weren't really feelers out to hear, you know, how is the community changing over time? What do we need to be doing differently? How do we need to be responding? And how do we need to be changing? Another organization here, a common refrain I heard throughout all of these interviews was something along the lines of equity is in our DNA, which is great, but you can't repeat something enough that you stop actively listening and stop actively trying to improve upon that. So one organization that cited this to me, they're a Catholic organization, and they had the metrics, right? They could show me the diversity of their governance structures, the diversity of that matched the diversity of the people that they served. They could show me how this broke down across lines of gender parity, lines of ableism, lines of race considerations. But when they actually started to reflect and actually started to go out into the community and listen to the needs of the people living in the area that they were trying to serve, they realized, oh, we have a fairly large blind spot in terms of serving the LGBTQ population in our area, which has been growing in recent years and has been struggling with issues of housing. So really having that eye always out, having those feelers out, really paid off in terms of allowing them to change over time. And this, of course, brings me to the second point of rooting in data, rooting in story. And I include these two here side by side to emphasize that, you know, there's often a focus on quantitative data and on metrics, but really qualitative data, stories, people's lived experience has to be a part of this and is just as important in these considerations as any numbers that you can put on the page. Numbers, stories, histories, they provide us with shared context, shared understanding, shared language. And so as boards, as organizations, as leaders, we need to be really examining the quality and the resolution of those data, of the kinds of stories that we're collecting. We need to provide greater access for, and again, listening to the community voices in the areas that we are trying to serve. Just to name one concrete example under these principles, board matrices, a number of organizations that I spoke to, a number of executive directors and board chairs in particular that I spoke to really cited having a custom board matrix as a really invaluable tool to making sure that their board was not only as diverse as it should be, but was also as inclusive as it should be. So traditional board matrices will often include things like skill sets. Do we have a lawyer? Do we have somebody from the business community? Do we have somebody with expertise in finance? And these boards were reevaluating that to say, okay, where do all of our board members live? What is their zip code? What is the demographic breakdown of our board? What is the age breakdown of our board? What's the gender breakdown of our board? And then going even further than that, when we have discussions around finance, when we have discussions around long-term strategy, who are the board members who speak up most often? Who are the board members who kind of sit in the back and don't feel as confident or don't feel as empowered or don't feel as valued in engaging in those conversations and speaking up, and then really using that kind of data. And again, not taking it as the end all be all, but saying we're going to continue to refine this and continue to look for more and more, using that kind of data to guide not only board recruitment efforts, but also improvement efforts to their own internal operations of the board and their own internal structures of the board. Moving on here, this takes me, of course, to focusing on people. And again, reminding us that boards are comprised of individuals who are volunteering their time, volunteering their expertise. My advisor here at the Kennedy School, Marshall Gans, has written extensively and speaks frequently on the fact that when you are trying to organize people, he has a long career as a labor organizer before coming back to academia, but when you're trying to organize people, when you're trying to get them to act for something that you think is important, people respond to being asked to do something important, but not necessarily, there's often this tendency to go to what is easy, right? It's like, oh, it's just this. It's just an hour every couple of weeks, or it's just input on our bylaws or finance or whatever it might be as they come up. Marshall pushes against that, says, people respond when you ask them to do something that's important, not necessarily something that's easy. One of the executive directors who I spoke to said in his board recruitment efforts, he often focuses on being upfront, being honest, saying, we ask for your time and we ask for it in a real substantive way, but we don't waste it. We're going to ask you to do important things, and we're going to make sure that you feel valued and empowered as you do those things. To this point towards the bottom here of providing support where needed, one organization noticed that members of its community that had represented on the board, they were left out of a lot of kind of the long-term strategy conversations, a lot of the conversations around this organization engages in a lot of real estate and equitable development. And the residents on the board weren't really engaged in that conversation because that felt way out of their wheelhouse. And so after talking to these members of the board about what they needed, they decided to offer real estate 101 classes and really take it as an opportunity to educate the entire board, but especially those who felt that this was a world entirely alien to their own experience, and really making sure that they felt empowered, not only in a resource manner or in ways that we typically think about when we think about empowering people or providing them with resources, but also really giving them the knowledge to fully engage in those conversations that we want them fully engaged in. I see that I'm running up on time, so quickly here, I want to really drive home this point in particular, that form determines function. If anyone who's familiar with Ibram X. Kendi's work, he talks about this extensively, but I really like this quote from Mark Joseph at the Kennedy Center, that if racism is structural, then anti-racism must also be structural. If systems of oppression, systems of occlusion are structural, we really need to be structural in our approach to inclusion, to bringing people into the fold, and using that as a model, structure reform to drive change over time is really at the basis of the kind of work that NeighborWorks America is trying to do and trying to promote over time across its network. So these are things that we know, right? Recruitment strategies dictate who gets in the room. Agendas decide what we discuss. Budgets reveal priorities. Committee structures reinforce power dynamics. Term limits drive rates of change. There are things we know. There are things that seem obvious when you say them like this, but there are things that need to be constantly reevaluated, constantly looked at, and constantly thought about even as we're trying to engage in work that can feel very personal, very squishy, very culture-based. We really need to be revisiting these structures and how kind of that form determines the function of what we're doing. And then finally, this point on iterating, weaving these practices of race, equity, diversity, inclusion throughout a governance board. It requires a continuous evolution to further the work. You need to keep listening, keep being willing to change, continually refining your data, seeking new stories, continue emphasizing the empowerment of the people in the room and bringing in new people and empowering them as well. And then evolving your forms as you continue to change over time to unlock new functions as you move forward. It takes time. It's long. It can be hard at times, and it's important, therefore, to celebrate progress as it happens. Really, applaud what you're getting right, but don't rest on your laurels. Don't let that stop the need to continue evolving, continue iterating, continue changing over time. I'm looking at the clock and I'm just about out of time, but I just want to end with a couple of quotes here. First from Dorothy Mae Richardson, who is a community organizer and the founder of the Pittsburgh Neighborhood Housing Service, which is the organization that NeighborWorks America traces its roots to. And she was asked by a reporter, how does change happen? And she replied to that reporter, you have to find out how the government works. And I charge all of us who are listening to this call, most of whom I assume are either presently or working to be in positions where we have decision-making power, where we have leadership responsibilities and roles, and really take this as a charge to us to look and see how does the governance of our own organization work, and not just how does it work on paper, but how does it actually work in practice, and how do we make sure that it's working for the people that we want it to work for. As interviewee said over the summer, our role, she was speaking about NeighborWorks, but I really think it applies to all of us. Our role is not to do to, it's to do with. And with that, thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you to both of you. We have about 15 minutes for questions. We've had several submitted, which I will try to curate. I apologize in advance that we probably won't get to all of them. Kyle, your next to last quote made me think as a sort of an open-ended question for both of you. A few things have changed since the summer. The pandemic, unfortunately, has got worse, as Ben noted. We had an election, and then this week, HUD announced a whole bunch of, with a new administration, a whole new group of people with an administration that's about to put another aid package before Congress. And as I said, HUD announced a whole bunch of appointments of folks. So imagine for a second that you're in that famous mythical elevator, and you only have a minute or so. If one of those wonderful new appointees at HUD said, what's one or two most important things that we could do from the federal level that would further the kind of progress that was being made in each of the areas you were talking about? What might you, on the spur of the moment, sort of come up with? What would you want them to take away? And maybe we'll start with Ben.
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, I'll definitely say that I think most of what I want to do with the answer to this question is like funnel things that are being suggested by the organizations I spoke with directly. So, I mean, definitely like I was able to note trends in the work that I was seeing, but I think the two biggest things that stood out is like seismic shifts in how aid could be allocated would be a much larger, and this wouldn't be HUD necessarily, but like a much larger allocation of funding for CDFIs if there's going to be future rounds of PPP funding, because you need financial institutions that actually have like taken the time to have like relationships with low-income communities and with Black communities specifically, and CDFIs and something called minority depository institutions, which are, it's like another classification of financial institution that is just, they just have much better track records of actually banking in Black communities. And so more funding that is specifically set aside for these organizations to administer, because it's actually shown to have the impact. And then the other I would say comes out of a suggestion from NHS of Los Angeles County, which is this idea of setting aside funds for affordable housing developers, and like having a fund in place if we're going to see rising mortgage foreclosure with the pandemic. And I, in all honesty, at this point, I'm like not very clear on what the trends have been. I think it seems that like we keep talking about like we might be on the precipice of something. It's probably a little bit more of a focus on evictions, but also this idea of a precipice on a lot of mortgage foreclosure. And obviously there's been a lot of people who have been unable to pay their mortgage. And so being ready for the possibility of like a lot of these properties coming onto the market and what that's going to mean in 10 years for the communities where they live, and especially like where people have been able to accumulate wealth through homeownership in the last, like, I mean, even sort of in repairing from what was done after the financial crisis and what people have been able to build back, a lot of that might be lost again. And so how do you keep some of that wealth local, and like how do you keep real estate speculators from coming in? I think there are some very clear requests from affordable housing developers to set aside funds and to set up a fund and to have a first right of purchase for affordable housing developers when those properties come onto the market, and to essentially preclude like real estate speculation from happening widespread in a lot of these counties where you're going to see a lot of turnover potentially.
Yeah, I would second everything that Ben said, and I think the points that I would just add on to that are really driving home those points about that I brought up in my presentation about ownership and listening, and really just, you know, this dichotomy between intent and impact. We really need both in this work, and we need this idea of constantly being willing to change in response to the feedback that we are hearing. And I really think the other thing I would add is just, you know, really investing in local communities, because HUD has great resources and has a great perspective on everything, but anything that they're going to be implementing eventually is going to be implemented at the local level, and really investing in the communities there and providing the people on the ground with the resources and knowledge and expertise. And I think also the frameworks to be learning kind of at the horizontal level from each other and seeing what each other are doing as they are working in their own local communities, I think is the role that HUD could be playing in a role like this.
Well, who knows? You may yet get the call from both of you may get the call from one of those. Ben, there's a question. Sharon Cornelissen posed a sort of interesting question about that there seemed to be a disconnect between the race neutral mission statements of many of the organizations and the racial equity work that they're doing. And she was just wondering, kind of, what are the implications of that choice? Is there a reason why organizations are keeping away from that language, and is that something that'll change? Kyle, you may later want to weigh in, because it seems to me there's a similar, actually, I'm going to build on that in a question I'm going to ask you in a second, Kyle, but Ben, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, thank you, David. I guess my first thought to that is maybe pushing back against the idea of a disconnect. And I think maybe when I entered with the question, that was maybe how I was thinking about it. But I think really what it boils down to from a lot of organizations is that they simply don't feel the need to phrase it in this way. This is something like there's been a decent amount of writing on the community development field and like how it approaches race. And I think there's sort of all sorts of reasons why organizations don't use racially explicit language. For me, what it seems like one of the major ones is, other than just like not feeling like they need to be that explicit, is also just that most community organizations like delineate their community by geography. And because of that, if you're like overly explicit about race, it's like there might be like the risk of like feeling like it's excluding people, because it's really more focused on like creating a community within a space, even though the community might predominantly be a community of color. So it seemed like for a lot of organizations, it didn't feel like a disconnect. And one of the other things that I heard mentioned was that, yes, this is definitely like race is a huge component of this, and it's a huge lens in the work, but it's still ultimately a matter of economics. And the people who are saying that, it wasn't to like preclude that those two things can both be true at the same time. It's like it was using both as a lens, but really coming back to this core concept of economics. And so I think a lot of organizations, especially like in their mission statement, they try to be quite clear about what the economic impact is that they're having. So like where they're focusing their resources. So that would be, I guess my main answer to that is that it didn't really seem like a disconnect for these organizations. Like it wasn't like they hadn't given much thought to it. It just was that they had acknowledged it, but it didn't seem like that was the move that they needed to make. I will say that I did hear from organizations feeling like they could be explicit for the first time. So I do think you will start to see more organizations that do include it in their mission statement. What I'm really interested in, and which I wasn't able to get into a lot of conversation with, but I'm really interested to see now as philanthropy, especially this year, and like as foundations are focusing on race-focused initiatives, how are you going to see organizations reposition their work in a different way? And that's when I start to think a lot about this idea of visibility and like how this work is made visible regardless of what its impact is. Because if you're having like if you're having an impact that's mitigating the disparate, that's mitigating the disparate impacts of the pandemic, but you're not making it clear that it's having that effect, like how are foundations and how are philanthropy organizations going to like deal with that? That's something I'm curious to see how people feel like they need to reposition their work. But I will say that I heard sort of all of the different threads of that. So some people are excited for this opportunity to be able to position it that way. Some are doubling down because they were already using the language. Some still don't really feel the need to be shifting the language. And so I think all of those things are kind of happening at the same time.
Kyle, a slightly related question, at least in my mind. Heather Hoffman asked, saying that she observes in her community work that people are sometimes not are a little bit afraid to speak up in part because they sort of fear retribution, and so I'm wondering, in the course of, or she's wondering, and now I'm wondering, in the course of your work, had you run across interesting practices to how you help basically give people the space and the security to know that they can speak up?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's a few things. I think it's being explicit about that and being upfront that is our intent. And then of course, again, striving to make sure that is the impact as well. But I also think it's both. The answer is both. It takes time and it takes people. And so on the time front, there's a lot of conversation. I was just in another conversation earlier today that was talking about kind of the role of government trust in community and economic development. And one of the other folks in that conversation brought up that, there's a lot of emphasis on citizens' trust of institutions, but there's not necessarily a lot of, and how do we get people to trust us? But there's not necessarily a lot of conversation around, okay, what can we do to earn trust? And that's not to say anything about bad intent or bad things, but just that really needs to be the focus of what can we be doing in our context, in our community, to really be earning the trust of the people and not just telling them to trust us. I think the other thing is to keep in mind is, a lot of communities have kind of informal or formal community leaders, whether those are people who are respected in that community and have their fingers on the pulse, or those are people who are actively organizing in the community, or that's other nonprofits that are working in the space, that are working with folks on the ground and have their own views and their own perspectives, and really acknowledging that if our goal as a nonprofit, our goal as this organization is to further our mission for the betterment of these communities, we're all kind of on the same page about we want to get here. We might differ in how we get there, and we might differ in what our approach is. But we can work together and kind of across those different issues where people want to have ownership of their own ideas, but working together to inform one another and really collectively drive the needle forward and drive the change forward.
I want to thank both of you. One of the missions of the Joint Center, or the mission of the Joint Center, is to sort of advance understanding of housing issues, and also to sort of train and encourage the next generation of leaders in the housing field. And I sure hope that whatever field both of you wind up in is going to greatly benefit. I hope that we've given you a little bit of the housing bug. In general, one of the major ways that we try to foster that is through our fellowships. As I mentioned, the Gramlich is one of several that the Joint Center offer. And if you are a student who's returning in the fall, please check out our fellowships and come to our information session Thursday at 5. If you are with a public entity or a nonprofit organization, a couple of our fellowships place students for the summer. The Gramlich is more of a research fellowship. And if you might be interested in hosting a fellow, probably virtually, but we're not sure this summer, feel free to reach out to me. The Gramlich Fellowship has 3 goals, I think. The first is to see if we can produce something that is useful to the organizations in the NeighborWorks network that are doing really important work. The second is to advance from the sort of academic research side an understanding of key issues. And the third is to provide some value to the students. I can guarantee you that we've met the first 2 goals in this. I think, having spoken with both of you, that we met the third. And I wish that you could hear that we had an opportunity that you could actually hear people give you the applause that you would have in person at the end, but know that it's there, know that in the messaging, the work you've done is really important. As I mentioned before, for those of you who are watching and want to tell others about this work, we will be posting the video, we will be posting the slides, and Ben and Kyle are both finishing up in their free time, which they don't have, final versions of their papers, which we will be publishing as Joint Center working papers. So please, all of you from the internet, join me in thanking Ben and Kyle for terrific work and terrific presentations. And I'm clapping on behalf of the many people who are here. Thank you.
Thank you, David.